Vivian Sinclair sat quietly on the stone bench beneath the shade of a flowering magnolia tree. The afternoon light filtered through the leaves, dappling the ground with shifting patterns. She cradled a simple thermos in her hands, its warmth a comforting contrast to the cool breeze. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe, to let the weight of the day slip from her shoulders. Her attire was modest, a cream-colored sweater and a pair of dark jeans. To a passerby, she might have seemed like any ordinary woman enjoying a brief reprieve from the city's endless hum. And that was exactly how Vivian preferred it. Being a billionaire was a reality she rarely allowed to define her. After years of relentless struggle and triumph, these quiet moments were precious, a reminder of her humanity amidst the chaos of success. But serenity is fragile, especially in a world where appearances speak louder than words. The sound of deliberate footsteps echoed against the pavement, breaking the delicate stillness. Vivian glanced up to see a uniformed police officer approaching. His movements brisk, his expression stern. He didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't offer the professional courtesy she'd observed given to others in the past. "Ma'am," he said, his tone clipped and laced with authority. "What are you doing here?" Vivian straightened slightly, her calm demeanor unwavering. "Just sitting, officer. Enjoying the afternoon." The man's name tag read B. Walker, though his posture suggested he didn't expect, or care, that she would remember it. His gaze traveled over her, lingering on the thermos in her hands, then flicking to her face. "This isn't a loitering zone," he said, his words slow and deliberate, as if trying to provoke a reaction. "You don't belong here." Vivian felt her breath catch a split-second pang of disbelief. It wasn't the first time her presence had been questioned in spaces where she had every right to be. She reminded herself to keep calm, to not give him any reason to escalate the situation. "I wasn't aware sitting on a public bench was against the law," she replied, her voice steady. Walker's lips curved into a humorless smile. "Depends on who's sitting." The remark hung in the air between them, sharp and bitter. Vivian's fingers tightened around the thermos as a familiar anger began to rise. It was the same quiet fury she had felt as a child when teachers assumed she wasn't capable, as a young professional when colleagues doubted her expertise, and even now. As one of the most successful business leaders in the country, when strangers dismissed her worth based on nothing more than skin and circumstance. Still, she remained calm. "Is there something I can help you with, officer?" Walker tilted his head, a sneer creeping onto his face. "Help me? No. I'm here to help you understand the rules. You see, this is a decent neighborhood. We don't tolerate, well, distractions like you hanging around." The words were a calculated insult, each syllable designed to remind her of where he believed she stood in the unspoken hierarchy of the world. Vivian felt her jaw tighten. Her instinct screamed at her to push back. But years of navigating these subtle confrontations had taught her the power of composure. "I live just a few blocks away," she said, her tone deliberate. "This is my neighborhood too." For a moment, Walker hesitated, his eyes narrowed as if trying to reconcile her claim with the reality he had constructed in his mind. But whatever doubt might have crossed his thoughts quickly dissolved into something harder, something meaner. "I'll need to see some ID," he said. The demand was laced with a quiet threat. It wasn't about verifying her residency, it was about control. About reminding her who held power in this moment. Vivian reached into her bag, keeping her movements slow and measured. She handed over her ID, watching as Walker inspected it with exaggerated scrutiny. The seconds stretched, the silence broken only by the faint rustle of leaves. When he finally handed it back, his expression hadn't softened. "You should move along," he said. "Find somewhere else to relax." Vivian slipped her ID back into her bag, her gaze never leaving his. "I'm not breaking any laws by sitting here. If you have a specific concern, you're welcome to explain it." Walker's eyes darkened. "You think you're clever?" he said, stepping closer. "Let me make something clear. You don't get to talk back to me." The shift in his tone sent a ripple of tension through the air. Vivian felt her heartbeat quicken. But she refused to flinch. This wasn't the first time she'd stood her ground in the face of intimidation. And she knew it wouldn't be the last. "Officer," she said, her voice firm, "if I'm not under arrest, I'd like to continue enjoying my afternoon. Walker's sneer deepened, his hand twitching toward his belt where his holstered weapon sat. It was a small, almost imperceptible motion, but its intent was clear. You're this close, he muttered, holding his thumb and forefinger just inches apart, to finding out how serious I can get. The weight of his threat pressed down on her, a stark reminder of how quickly situations like these could spiral. But before either of them could move, a sharp voice cut through the tension. That's enough. Both Vivian and Walker turned toward the sound. A man stood a few yards away, his posture confident, his expression resolute. He was dressed in plain clothes, but there was an undeniable authority in his voice. Walker bristled. Who the hell are you? The man stepped closer, his gaze locked on Walker. Someone who saw everything, he said, and someone who's not afraid to hold you accountable. For the first time, Vivian saw uncertainty flicker across Walker's face. He straightened, glancing around as if realizing, belatedly, that the street wasn't as empty as he had assumed. Vivian met the stranger's eyes, a quiet gratitude passing between them. She wasn't alone anymore. Walker took a step back, his expression sour but his hands finally dropping to his sides. This isn't over, he muttered, his voice low enough that only Vivian could hear. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. As Walker retreated, Vivian stood tall, her resolve as steady as ever. The man approached her, offering a faint smile. Are you all right? Vivian nodded. Thank you. But even as relief began to settle in, she knew this was only the beginning. The confrontation had stirred something deeper, a determination not just to defend herself, but to challenge the forces that allowed moments like this to happen in the first place. And for that, she would need more than resolve. She would need justice. The police station was a stark contrast to the warmth of the sunny afternoon Vivian had left behind. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a cold, clinical glow on the linoleum floors and the steel desks scattered throughout the space. The air carried a faint smell of stale coffee and disinfectant, a combination that only added to the sterile, unwelcoming atmosphere. Vivian sat quietly in the corner of the waiting area, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She could feel the weight of the room pressing against her, attention that was both palpable and unspoken. Officers moved past her without acknowledgement, their footsteps echoing against the hard floors. She caught the occasional sideways glance, a flicker of curiosity or disdain. But no one stopped to speak. The chair beneath her was cold, its metal frame unforgiving. She shifted slightly, feeling the stiffness settle into her back. Across the room, Officer Walker leaned against the front desk, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't look at her directly, but she could feel the hostility radiating from him, a simmering anger that hadn't dissipated since their encounter on the street. A younger officer approached Walker, holding a clipboard. They exchanged a few words in hushed tones, their voices too low for Vivian to catch. She didn't need to hear them to know what they were discussing. Her presence here, her resistance, her unwillingness to shrink in the face of intimidation. It all challenged an unspoken order, one that people like Walker were determined to uphold. Vivian closed her eyes briefly, drawing in a slow, steady breath. She reminded herself to remain calm, to hold on to the composure that had carried her through countless trials before this one. But even as she tried to center herself, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that this was different. This wasn't a boardroom or a courtroom where logic and reason could prevail. This was a place where power dynamics were laid bare, where authority often went unchecked, and where people like her were too often silenced. The sound of a door opening pulled her from her thoughts. A woman in a sharp navy blue suit stepped into the room, her heels clicking against the floor with precision. Her presence was commanding, her posture straight and confident. She carried a sleek leather briefcase in one hand, and her expression was one of quiet determination. "Miss Sinclair," the woman said, her voice steady and calm. "I'm Sandra Mills, your attorney." Vivian stood, smoothing the front of her sweater. "Thank you for coming." Sandra nodded, her gaze briefly flicking toward Walker before returning to Vivian. "Let's find a private space to talk." The two women were led to a small, windowless room near the back of the station. A single table occupied the center of the space, flanked by two metal chairs. The walls were bare, their neutral tones offering no comfort. Sandra set her briefcase on the table and opened it, pulling out a notepad and pen. She motioned for Vivian to sit, her expression softening slightly as she took the seat across from her. "Tell me everything," Sandra said, her tone patient but firm. "Don't leave anything out." Vivian began recounting the events of the afternoon, her voice even as she described Walker's condescension, his threats, and the moment he shoved her. As she spoke, Sandra took meticulous notes, her pen moving swiftly across the paper. When Vivian finished, Sandra set her pen down and folded her hands on the table. "This isn't just about Walker," she said, her voice low but resolute. "This is about a system that allows people like him to operate without accountability. He thought he could treat you this way because he assumed no one would stand up to him. We're going to prove him wrong." Vivian nodded, a flicker of determination igniting in her chest. "What happens now?" "First, we ensure your safety," Sandra replied. "I've already filed a formal complaint against Walker, and we'll push for an internal investigation. But we need to prepare for resistance. He's not going to back down easily. And neither will the people protecting him." The weight of Sandra's words settled over Vivian like a heavy cloak. She knew this fight would be difficult, that it would require more than courage. It would demand resilience, patience, and an unwavering commitment to justice. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Daniel Reed stepped into the room, his expression a mixture of concern and determination. "I spoke to a few people who saw what happened on the street," he said, addressing both women. "Some of them are willing to provide statements. They were hesitant at first. But I think they'll come around." Sandra nodded. "Good. Witnesses will strengthen our case." Vivian met Daniel's gaze, a quiet gratitude passing between them. "Thank you," she said softly. Daniel shook his head. "You don't need to thank me. I just couldn't stand by and let him get away with it." The three of them sat in silence for a moment, the gravity of the situation hanging heavily in the air. Outside the room, the faint murmur of voices and the distant hum of activity reminded them that the world was still moving, still indifferent to the injustice they were fighting to expose. As they prepared to leave the station, Vivian felt the cold stare of Officer Walker from across the room. His expression was unreadable, but his presence was a reminder that this battle was far from over. Stepping into the late afternoon light, Vivian drew in a deep breath. The city stretched out before her, its streets alive with the hum of activity. She felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease, replaced by a quiet resolve. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been dismissed, disrespected, or silenced because of their race, their gender, or their circumstances. And though the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, Vivian knew one thing with absolute certainty: she would not back down. The fight for justice had only just begun. The days that followed Vivian's arrest were both a whirlwind and an eerie calm. The city buzzed with its usual rhythm, cars honking, vendors calling out, and pedestrians weaving through crowded sidewalks. Yet for Vivian, each moment felt like it carried a strange weight, as though the air itself were thicker, the sounds more distant. In her quiet home office, Vivian sat at a wide wooden desk, papers scattered around her. The room, usually her sanctuary of thought and planning, now felt like a battleground. Statements from witnesses, legal documents prepared by Sandra, and news clippings about her case covered every inch of the surface. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows highlighted her furrowed brow as she reviewed each detail. On her laptop screen, news articles about the incident multiplied. Headlines ranged from supportive, "Black business leader challenges police misconduct," to skeptical, "Is this justice or a publicity stunt?" The accompanying comment sections revealed the stark divide in public opinion. Some called her brave for standing up against injustice, others questioned her intentions, accusing her of exploiting her wealth and influence. Vivian leaned back in her chair, letting out a slow breath. This wasn't unfamiliar territory. As a woman of color in the upper echelons of business, she had faced skepticism and judgment her entire career. But this was different. The scrutiny felt more personal, the stakes impossibly higher. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called, her voice steady. The door opened to reveal Daniel Reed. His expression a mix of weariness and determination. He carried a thick manila folder, the edges worn as though it had been handled repeatedly. "I've gathered everything I could," he said, stepping inside. He placed the folder on her desk and gestured to the documents within. Witness statements, prior complaints against Walker, even some reports that were quietly buried. "It's not pretty, Vivian." Vivian opened the folder, her eyes scanning the neatly typed pages. Each report painted a grim picture, a pattern of intimidation, unjustified stops, and excessive force, all involving individuals who couldn't fight back. "Why wasn't any of this acted on?" she asked, her voice calm but tinged with disbelief. Daniel sighed, pulling a chair closer to her desk. "Because the system protects its own. People like Walker know how to work within the gray areas, how to push just far enough without triggering serious consequences. And when someone does complain, it gets lost in bureaucracy, or dismissed entirely." Vivian's fingers traced the edge of one report, her mind turning over the implications. "And yet he still operates with impunity," she said softly. Daniel nodded. "It's not just about him. It's about what he represents. For every Walker, there's a dozen more just like him, operating with the same sense of invincibility." A silence settled between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, as if reflecting the weight of their conversation. "Where does Sandra stand on this?" Vivian asked after a moment. "She's been relentless," Daniel replied. "She's not just building a case against Walker, she's aiming higher. She wants this to shine a light on the entire system that allows people like him to thrive." Vivian's lips pressed into a thin line. "Good. That's exactly what needs to happen." Later that evening, Vivian and Sandra sat in the corner of a quiet cafe. The low hum of conversation around them provided a backdrop of anonymity, a small relief from the public spotlight. Sandra spread out a series of photographs and documents across their table, her sharp eyes scanning each one before explaining. "This," Sandra said, pointing to a grainy black and white image, "is from a traffic stop Walker conducted 2 years ago. The driver filed a complaint alleging harassment, but the case was closed without action." She slid another photo forward. "And here's another from last year. A local shop owner accused Walker of intimidation, claiming he demanded money in exchange for protection. Again, no follow-up." Vivian studied each photo, her expression unreadable. "It's a pattern," she said quietly. Sandra nodded. "Exactly, but patterns alone won't win this case. We need people willing to speak out, to testify." Vivian's gaze met Sandra's. "Do we have anyone willing to step forward?" Sandra hesitated, then nodded slowly. "One. A former officer named Grant. He worked with Walker for years and recently reached out to me. He says he's seen enough and wants to help." Vivian tilted her head, intrigued. "Why now?" "He says your case gave him the push he needed," Sandra explained. "Seeing you stand up to Walker made him realize his silence was part of the problem." Vivian sat back in her chair, her mind turning over this new information. She knew the risks Grant was taking by coming forward. Whistleblowers were rarely celebrated, especially in an institution that valued loyalty over accountability. "I want to meet him," she said finally. Sandra nodded. "I'll arrange it. But Vivian, I need you to be prepared. This won't be easy. The department will push back hard. They'll try to discredit you, Grant, anyone who supports this case." Vivian's expression hardened, her resolve clear. "I've faced worse. They can try, but I'm not backing down." That night, as Vivian sat alone in her living room, she allowed herself a moment to reflect. The city lights twinkled outside her window, their glow muted by the haze of the evening air. She thought of the people who had come before her, those who had fought battles in silence because they didn't have the platform or resources to demand justice. She thought of the young girl she once was, navigating a world that often seemed determined to keep her in her place. Now, she had the means to fight, not just for herself, but for those who couldn't. And while the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear: this was a battle worth fighting. As the clock ticked past midnight, Vivian closed her eyes and let out a deep breath. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new confrontations, but for tonight, She held onto the quiet, the stillness, and the strength that had carried her this far. The shadows of the system were vast and complex. But Vivian was determined to shine a light on every corner. The meeting with Officer Grant took place in a nondescript office downtown. Far from the spotlight of the media, Vivian arrived early, accompanied by Sandra and Daniel, her calm demeanor masking the tension beneath. The small room was sparsely furnished, with only a wooden table, 4 chairs, and a flickering fluorescent light overhead. Grant was already there when they entered, his uniform replaced by a plain shirt and jeans. He stood as they approached, his posture stiff but his expression resolute. Vivian extended her hand, which he hesitated for a moment before shaking firmly. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," she said, her voice steady. Grant nodded, his eyes flickering between Vivian and Sandra. "I should have spoken out a long time ago," he said, his tone low. "I stayed silent because it was easier. But after seeing what happened to you, I couldn't ignore it anymore." They sat across from each other, Sandra wasting no time in opening her notebook. "Officer Grant, I understand the risks you're taking by coming forward. Let's start with what you've seen." Grant glanced at his hands, which rested on the table. His knuckles were tight, his shoulders rigid. Then he exhaled deeply and began to speak. As Grant recounted his experiences, his voice carried the weight of years of silence. He described Walker's actions in detail. The unnecessary stops, the intimidation tactics, the way he preyed on those least able to defend themselves. "There was this one incident," Grant said, his gaze fixed on the table. "A young black man was walking home late at night. Walker stopped him for no reason, accused him of loitering. The kid was terrified, kept saying he didn't do anything wrong. Walker just laughed and kept pushing him, trying to provoke him into reacting. When the kid finally snapped and yelled back, Walker arrested him for resisting." The room fell silent, the gravity of Grant's words settling heavily in the air. Vivian's expression remained composed, but her hands tightened in her lap. "Why didn't you report him then?" Sandra asked, her tone free of accusation but firm. Grant sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Because I knew what would happen. Anyone who speaks out gets labeled a troublemaker. Your career stalls, your colleagues turn on you. And Walker, he's protected. The higher-ups know what he does. But they look the other way because he gets results." Sandra exchanged a glance with Vivian, who leaned forward slightly. "What made you change your mind now?" Vivian asked. Grant hesitated, then met her gaze directly. "Because of you. I saw how you stood your ground. Even when you were alone. I realized that if someone with your strength and influence could face this and still fight back, then I didn't have any excuse to stay silent." Vivian nodded slowly, her voice calm but resolute. "This isn't just about me, Officer Grant. It's about everyone who's been targeted, dismissed, or silenced. And it's about people like you who choose to do the right thing, even when it's difficult." After the meeting, Vivian and Sandra returned to her office, the weight of Grant's testimony lingering between them. Sandra began compiling the information they had gathered, her focus unbroken as she typed on her laptop. "What do you think his chances are?" Vivian asked, breaking the silence. Sandra looked up, her expression thoughtful. "If he testifies, it could be a turning point. But he'll face backlash, and the department will do everything they can to discredit him. We need to be prepared for that." Vivian leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the city skyline outside the window. "He's risking everything," she said softly. "So are you," Sandra replied. That evening, Vivian found herself scrolling through the flood of messages on her phone. Supportive texts from friends and colleagues mingled with hateful comments from strangers, each one a stark reminder of the polarized world she was navigating. One message, however, stood out. It was from a young woman who had seen Vivian's story on the news. "I've been stopped and harassed so many times." The message read, "But seeing you fight back gives me hope. Thank you for standing up for all of us." Vivian read the message twice, the words settling deep within her. She had always known this fight was bigger than herself, but moments like this brought it into sharp focus. In the days that followed, Grant's testimony became a critical piece of their case. His willingness to expose the truth sent ripples through the department. prompting whispers and speculation among his colleagues. Some called him a hero, others branded him a traitor. Vivian, meanwhile, continued to prepare for the battles ahead. She knew the road would only get harder. But she also knew she wasn't walking it alone. As she sat in her quiet office one night, the city lights twinkling outside her window, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. The fight against injustice was a long one, filled with setbacks and sacrifices. But it was a fight worth enduring. Not just for herself but for the countless others who had been silenced. The shadows of prejudice and abuse loomed large. But Vivian was determined to bring them into the light. The morning was unusually quiet as Vivian prepared for the press conference. The air in her apartment felt heavy, the kind of weight that signaled something important was about to unfold. She stood by the window, sipping a cup of tea, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The city below bustled with its usual rhythm, oblivious to the storm brewing in the corridors of power. Vivian's thoughts wandered to her childhood, to the quiet resilience her mother had taught her. Strength isn't about shouting the loudest, her mother had often said. It's about standing firm when the world tells you to sit down. Those words echoed now, steadying her nerves. At the press conference, the room was filled to capacity. Rows of journalists sat poised with notebooks and microphones, their eyes trained on the podium where Vivian would soon stand. Cameras lined the back wall, their lenses gleaming under the bright overhead lights. Sandra stood beside Vivian, her sharp eyes scanning the room. They'll throw tough questions, she said quietly. Stay calm, stay clear, and don't let them rattle you. Vivian nodded, her composure intact despite the growing pressure. This isn't just about me, she replied. It's about showing people that silence doesn't have to be the answer. When Vivian stepped to the podium, the room hushed. She took a moment to meet the eyes of the audience, her calm gaze holding their attention. Thank you for being here, she began, her voice even but firm. I stand before you today not as a billionaire, but as someone who has experienced injustice firsthand. What happened to me is not unique. It is part of a pattern that many face but few have the platform to challenge. The room was silent, save for the occasional click of a camera. Vivian's words carried the weight of someone who had lived through the very inequalities she spoke of. I am not here to seek revenge or to fan the flames of anger, she continued. I am here to demand accountability. Not just from the individual who wronged me, but from the system that allowed it to happen. The questions came quickly after her speech. Some supportive, others sharp and probing. Miss Sinclair, critics have accused you of using this incident to boost your public image. How do you respond to that? One journalist asked, his tone skeptical. Vivian turned to face him, her expression steady. My image doesn't need boosting, she replied. I have worked hard for everything I have achieved. This isn't about fame or fortune, it's about ensuring that no one, regardless of their background or status, has to face what I did. Her answer was met with a murmur of approval, though a few journalists exchanged doubtful glances. Another voice rang out. Do you believe this case will lead to meaningful change? Or is it just another headline that will fade away? Vivian paused, choosing her words carefully. Change doesn't happen overnight, she said, but every step, no matter how small, brings us closer to a society where fairness and justice are not just ideals, but realities. This case is a step, a necessary one. And I intend to see it through. As the conference ended, Vivian felt a mixture of exhaustion and relief. The weight of the moment lingered, but so did the sense of purpose that had driven her to speak out in the first place. Daniel and Sandra joined her as she exited the building, the cool air outside a welcome reprieve from the heat of the room. A small crowd of supporters had gathered, their cheers and words of encouragement a reminder that she was not alone in this fight. One woman approached Vivian, her voice trembling with emotion. Thank you, she said, for standing up, for giving people like me hope. Vivian placed a hand on the woman's shoulder, her expression softening. Hope is what keeps us moving forward, she replied. That evening, Vivian sat in her office, the city lights casting a warm glow through the large windows. She reviewed the day's events with Sandra and Daniel. Their conversation focused on the next steps. Grant's testimony will be pivotal, Sandra said, flipping through her notes. But we need more voices. More evidence to show that this isn't an isolated incident. Daniel leaned forward, his tone thoughtful. What about the community? If we can find others who faced similar treatment, it could strengthen our case. Vivian nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. We need to shine a light on the stories that have been buried. She said, every voice matters. As the night deepened, Vivian found herself alone with her thoughts. The road ahead was daunting, filled with uncertainty and opposition. But as she looked out at the city she had come to call home, she felt a quiet resolve. The fight for justice wasn't about grand gestures or quick victories. It was about persistence, about chipping away at the walls of prejudice and inequality one step at a time. And as long as there were voices willing to speak, the silence could never win. Vivian closed her eyes, the weight of the day giving way to a sense of calm determination. The journey was far from over, but she was ready for whatever lay ahead. The courtroom was still, the kind of silence that weighed heavily on everyone present. Sunlight filtered through the high windows, casting pale beams onto the polished wood surfaces. Vivian sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded neatly before her, her expression calm but resolute. Beside her, Sandra leafed through a thick stack of papers, her pen poised to underline or annotate at a moment's notice. Across the room, Officer Walker sat with his legal team, his jaw tight, his hands clasped together on the table. His expression betrayed little, but his shoulders were stiff, and his gaze darted nervously around the room. As the trial resumed, the first witness was called, Officer Grant. His crisp uniform seemed at odds with the tension he carried in his stance. As he approached the stand, he avoided looking at Walker, instead fixing his gaze on the jury. Officer Grant, Sandra began, her voice measured and professional. How long have you worked with Officer Walker? 8 years, Grant replied, his voice steady but subdued. And in that time, have you observed any behavior from Officer Walker that would suggest misuse of authority? Grant hesitated, the weight of his words visibly pressing on him. Yes, he said finally, his voice firm but low. I've seen him target individuals unfairly, particularly those he perceived as vulnerable or unlikely to fight back. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, a low wave of whispers that the judge quickly silenced with a rap of the gavel. Vivian watched Grant intently, sensing his internal conflict. It wasn't easy to speak out against a colleague, especially in a system that often prioritized loyalty over justice. Yet, as Grant recounted specific incidents, his tone grew more assured, as though the act of speaking truth steadied him. When Sandra asked if he had ever intervened, Grant's voice faltered. No, he admitted, shame creeping into his words. I stayed silent, but seeing what happened to Miss Sinclair, I realized that silence makes me complicit. I couldn't stay silent any longer. Walker's lawyer rose for the cross-examination, his steps deliberate and his voice smooth. Officer Grant, he began, isn't it true that you and Officer Walker have had disagreements in the past? Could your testimony today be motivated by personal grievances? Grant didn't flinch. This isn't personal, he replied. This is about justice. What I've seen and stayed silent about. What we all allowed to happen. Was wrong. The lawyer pressed further, his tone sharpening. You're putting your career at risk with these claims. Are you certain you're not exaggerating to protect yourself from potential backlash? Grant straightened in his seat. I'm risking my career because it's the right thing to do, he said firmly. It's about time someone held us accountable. Vivian exhaled slowly as Grant stepped down, the weight of his testimony lingering in the air. She admired his courage but couldn't ignore the tension it brought into the room. The jury exchanged glances, their faces a mix of contemplation and unease. The next witness was called, a community member who had experienced similar treatment from Walker. Their voices trembled as they described being stopped and interrogated without cause, their words painting a picture of fear and humiliation. Each testimony built upon the last, weaving a narrative of systemic prejudice that was difficult to ignore. During a recess, Vivian sat quietly in the hallway, the buzz of whispered conversations surrounding her like static. Daniel joined her, his expression a mix of pride and concern. You're holding up well, he said, his voice low. I have to, Vivian replied, her gaze distant. This isn't just about me. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Daniel nodded, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. You're doing more than that. You're giving people a voice. People who thought they'd never be heard. When the trial resumed, Sandra called Vivian to the stand. The courtroom grew silent again as she made her way forward, her steps measured and deliberate. Sandra began her questioning gently, guiding Vivian through the events that had brought them here. Vivian's voice was steady as she recounted the encounter with Walker, her words clear and precise. What were you thinking at that moment? Sandra asked. Vivian paused, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the stand. I was thinking about how often people like me, people who look like me, are judged before we even speak. She said, I was thinking about how many times I've had to prove my worth. My humanity, in ways others never have to. Her words hung in the air, resonating deeply with those who listened. As the trial moved toward closing arguments, Sandra stood before the jury, her tone calm but commanding. This case isn't just about one incident, she said. It's about a pattern, a system that allows prejudice to persist unchecked. Today, you have the power to say that this is not acceptable. That justice applies to everyone, regardless of their background or the color of their skin. Walker's lawyer countered with arguments about the pressures of law enforcement and the need for split-second decisions. But the jury's faces remained impassive, their eyes returning often to Vivian, to Grant, and to the community members who had spoken out. That evening, as Vivian left the courthouse, she felt the exhaustion of the day settle into her bones. But alongside it was a quiet sense of accomplishment. The truth had been spoken. And though the outcome was uncertain, the weight of silence had been lifted. As she looked out at the gathering twilight, Vivian thought of her mother's words. Strength is about standing firm. She knew that whatever the verdict, she had done just that. And in doing so, she had lit a spark that could not be extinguished. The courtroom echoed with a quiet tension as the second week of the trial began. Each passing day had peeled back another layer of injustice. But the atmosphere remained heavy. The jury's faces betrayed exhaustion and reflection, their expressions revealing the weight of the testimony they had heard. For Vivian Sinclair, the fight for justice was becoming a test of endurance as much as conviction. Vivian sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, her fingers tracing the edge of a legal pad. Sandra leaned in, whispering updates about the day's agenda. Across the room, Officer Walker sat stoically, his hands folded tightly, his jaw rigid. The cracks in his confident facade were becoming more apparent, though his legal team worked hard to conceal them. As proceedings resumed, Walker's defense sought to shift the narrative. They called a former colleague to the stand, a retired officer who spoke in measured tones about the challenges of policing. Officer Walker, the man said, glancing at the defendant, was a good cop. Firm, yes, but fair. The kind of officer who understood the importance of maintaining order. Sandra's eyes narrowed as she listened. When her turn came to cross-examine, her questions were precise. You mentioned that Officer Walker was firm. Would you say he ever used unnecessary force? The witness hesitated, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. I can't speak to every situation, he said finally. Sandra pressed gently but firmly. Would it surprise you to learn that multiple complaints have been filed against Officer Walker for misconduct? Some of which involved excessive force? The witness shifted in his seat. I wasn't aware of that. Thank you, Sandra said, stepping back. The exchange, though brief, added another thread to the tapestry of doubts surrounding Walker's conduct. Outside the courthouse during the lunch recess, Vivian sat on a bench beneath a wide oak tree. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves. Daniel joined her, handing her a cup of coffee. You're holding up better than I expected, he said, a small smile playing on his lips. Vivian returned the smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. I don't think I have a choice, she said quietly. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's been silenced or dismissed. Daniel nodded, his gaze distant. It's not just Walker we're up against. It's the system that allows people like him to thrive. That's a much harder fight. Vivian sipped her coffee, the warmth grounding her. The harder the fight, the more important it is to keep going, she said. Back in the courtroom, Sandra called another witness, a civilian who had experienced Walker's hostility firsthand. The man was middle-aged. His shoulders slightly hunched as though bearing an invisible weight. He stopped me a few months ago. The man began, his voice low but steady. Said I looked suspicious because I was walking in a neighborhood I didn't belong in. And did he explain what he meant by that? Sandra asked. The man shook his head. No, he didn't have to. I knew what he meant. Did he charge you with any crime? No, he just humiliated me in front of my kids. The man's testimony was brief but powerful, adding to the growing picture of a pattern of abuse. That evening, as the courthouse emptied, Vivian lingered behind. The corridors were quiet, the hum of the city outside muffled by thick walls. She found herself drawn to the gallery of portraits lining one hallway. Images of past judges and attorneys who had shaped the institution's history. Sandra approached, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. Heavy thoughts? She asked. Vivian nodded. I was just thinking about how much these walls have seen. How many stories like mine have passed through here. Some finding justice, others fading into silence. Sandra studied her for a moment. This case is different, Vivian. You've brought something to the surface that people can't ignore. And even if the verdict doesn't go our way, the truth is out there now. That matters. Vivian turned to face her, a flicker of doubt in her eyes. But will it be enough to change anything? Sandra's expression softened. Change is slow, and it's often incomplete. But every fight like this moves the needle, even if it's just a little. As Vivian left the courthouse that night, the city seemed quieter than usual. The weight of the trial bore down on her. But so did the quiet strength she carried from the people who believed in her, Daniel, Sandra, Officer Grant, and countless others who had found courage in her stand. Walking to her car, Vivian caught sight of a group of young activists gathered near the courthouse steps. Their signs bore words like "Justice for all" and "Stand up." "Speak out." One of them noticed her and waved. "Miss Sinclair," the young woman called, her voice filled with admiration. "You're inspiring all of us. Thank you for fighting." Vivian paused, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and responsibility. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice carrying in the still night. "Keep fighting, too." As she drove home, Vivian reflected on the day's events. The trial was far from over, and the outcome was uncertain. But the ripple effects were undeniable. The shadows of resistance were still present. But so was the light of change. For the first time in a long while, Vivian felt hope. Not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told to sit down and stay silent. The courtroom was filled with an almost reverent silence as the jury filed back in. Their faces composed but etched with the weight of deliberation. For Vivian Sinclair, the moment felt suspended in time. She sat straight-backed, her hands resting lightly on the table before her, every breath measured and deliberate. Sandra was beside her, her face calm but her eyes sharp, fixed on the jury foreperson. Daniel, seated just behind them, leaned slightly forward, as if willing the universe to deliver justice. The foreperson rose, a single piece of paper held in trembling hands. The tension in the room was palpable, and even the smallest rustle of fabric seemed amplified in the hush. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Bryce Walker." A pause hung in the air like a held breath. "Guilty on all counts." For a moment, there was no reaction, just the collective exhale of a room that had been holding its breath. Then, a quiet murmur began, rippling through the crowd. The defendant's table remained motionless. Walker's face was pale, his eyes wide as he stared straight ahead. The reality of the verdict settling over him like a weight. Vivian allowed herself only the smallest nod, her expression remaining composed. Her victory wasn't about personal vindication. It was about a much larger fight. She turned to Sandra, who gave her a slight, affirming smile, and then to Daniel, whose relief and pride were evident in his tear-brimmed eyes. Outside the courthouse, the scene was one of restrained celebration. A small crowd had gathered, supporters holding signs, reporters clutching microphones, and curious onlookers drawn by the gravity of the case. As Vivian stepped onto the courthouse steps, a ripple of applause broke out. But she raised her hand gently, signaling for quiet. Facing the crowd, she spoke in a voice steady but filled with conviction. Today's verdict is a step toward justice. But it's not the end of the journey. It's a reminder that power must be held accountable and that silence in the face of injustice is complicity. This fight wasn't just about me. It was about everyone who has been dismissed, disrespected, or denied dignity. We still have work to do. Her words were met with a solemn nodding of heads. The gravity of the moment felt by everyone present. The applause that followed was respectful, not exuberant, as if the crowd understood that this victory was just one step in a much larger battle. In the days that followed, the ripple effects of the trial spread far beyond the courtroom. News outlets dissected the case, highlighting both the systemic issues it exposed and the courage it took to bring those issues to light. Vivian's name became a symbol not just of resilience but of quiet, determined resistance. At her office, Vivian sat with Sandra and Daniel, reviewing the reforms they had begun to draft. It's not enough to punish one bad actor, Sandra said, her voice calm but resolute. We have to address the structures that allow people like Walker to thrive. Vivian nodded. We'll start with the police department. But we can't stop there. This case showed how deeply ingrained these issues are. Training, oversight, accountability, everything needs to change. Daniel added, and we need to ensure that people like Grant, those who stand up for what's right, are protected and encouraged, not punished for their courage. The room fell quiet as they contemplated the road ahead. It was daunting, but the resolve in their faces was unshakable. Weeks turned into months, and the case's impact began to unfold. Walker's conviction prompted a broader investigation into the department's practices, leading to the suspension of several other officers with histories of misconduct. New policies were implemented, including mandatory training on bias and de-escalation, as well as a system for independent oversight of complaints against officers. Vivian stayed involved every step of the way, not as an outsider seeking retribution but as a partner in the effort to create meaningful change. She spoke at community meetings, attended panels on justice reform, and quietly funded initiatives aimed at bridging the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served. One evening, Vivian found herself back at the park where the ordeal had begun. The bench where she had been sitting that day was now unoccupied, its surface dappled with the light of a setting sun. She sat down, letting the coolness of the metal seep through her coat, and closed her eyes for a moment. Mind if I join you? A voice asked gently. Vivian opened her eyes to see Officer Grant, now dressed in plain clothes but still carrying the air of quiet determination that had marked his testimony. She gestured for him to sit, and he settled beside her. I wanted to thank you, he said after a moment, for giving me the courage to do what I should have done a long time ago. Vivian shook her head. You didn't need me to find your courage, Grant. You already had it. You just needed the right moment to act. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching as children played in the distance and joggers passed by. The world seemed peaceful, but Vivian knew better than to mistake calm for resolution. There was still so much to do. But for now, this moment felt like a small victory. As Vivian walked home that evening, her thoughts were quieter than they had been in months. She thought about the people she had met on this journey, Sandra's fierce determination, Daniel's unwavering support, Grant's reluctant but brave stand. They were reminders that even in the face of deep-rooted injustice, change was possible when people choose to act with integrity. The world wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But as the city lights began to twinkle against the darkening sky, Vivian felt a sense of hope. Change was slow, often frustrating, but it was also inevitable when people refused to give up. And so, with steady steps and a resolute heart, Vivian Sinclair continued her journey. Not as a victim, but as a quiet force for justice in a world that desperately needed it.